Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this third installment of 5 Cars That. This time we're going to be heading into the realms of the theoretical and looking at 5 concept race cars for the road that were based on Le Mans developed technologies but never made it to production, which, generally speaking, more's the pity. These 5 are in reverse timeline order, starting with the most recent and going back in time to the 1950s. There's also something of a preponderance of German machinery, but we're going to start off with what one could consider a German-Japanese collaboration, the Toyota GR Supersport. Which, yes, Toyota themselves are headquartered squarely and unquestionably in Japan, but Toyota's endurance operations through Gazoo Racing, previously Toyota Motorsport, have long been based out of Köln, Germany. In the late 2010s, the main product of these operations were the final TS Racing prototypes, culminating in the TS050 LMP1, which granted Toyota their first victories at La Sarthe, and by the time 2020 was on the horizon, was the only factory-supported car still racing in the class. Thus, victory wasn't particularly challenging. As we all know and have discussed previously, the exorbitant costs of the late LMP1 era had pushed out previous competitors Audi and Porsche and created sufficient barriers to entry to prevent new manufacturers from taking their place. The ACO and FIA, recognizing that nobody was particularly interested in watching yet another decade of sole manufacturer dominance of Le Mans, after Audi had done so the previous decade and a half. The 90s were a bit of a wash, the 80s were Porsche and then Jag, the 70s were Porsche, the 60s were Ferrari, then Ford. At least that was interesting. Anyway, they decided it was time to change the rules again. They announced in 2018 that LMP1 was not long for this world, and it would be replaced in 2020, or at least sometime in the 2020s, with a new hypercar class, intended to tie prototypes once again more closely in with companion road cars, and greatly reduce costs, targeting a full season budget of approximately 25 million euros rather than the 100 million plus budgets that had typified the LMP1 hybrid era. To this end, the original draft of the regulations had requirements for a minimum weight of 2,160 pounds or 980 kilos, a larger cockpit that could fit 2 seats, and a road car-inspired roofline. There were controls on weight distribution, fuel usage, engine efficiency, and limitations on the hybrid systems that could be deployed, while engine design would be relatively flexible to encourage manufacturers to use pre-existing, or ideally road car-based power plants. Target power output was reported as somewhere around 950 horsepower, although this was a simple target for combined engine and hybrid output, so mechanical specifics would have been a bit more prescriptive in the final draft of the regulations. There was a requirement for a production run of 25 road cars by the end of a racer's first season, with 75 additional expected by the end of the second. This was added by the end of 2018, with manufacturer interest from Toyota, Glickenhaus, and Aston Martin projected as first season entries, and McLaren, Mercedes, and by Collis possible eventually. Aston planned to use the Valkyrie, which of course has finally come to pass several years later than intended, and Toyota was reportedly looking at further development of this car, the Toyota GR Supersport concept, which had been revealed earlier that year. The GR Supersport concept was designed as the Toyota sports super hypercar of the future, deriving its aesthetics and mechanicals from the soon-to-be superannuated TS050 hybrid. This meant a mid-mounted 2.4-liter twin-turbo V6 and a lithium-ion battery hybrid system nominally capable of a combined 986 horsepower, although this total output was really deployable with the TS050's push-to-pass system. As this was intended as a road car, engine power would have probably gone to the rear wheels with a modified version of the TS050's 6-speed sequential gearbox, possibly reviving the 7th gear that had been used in the 2016 season, with the modifications emphasizing drivability at lower speeds instead of maximally efficient running at 220 miles an hour down the Mulsanne Straight. The hybrid system would have continued to send power most likely to all four wheels using a combination of Denso and Aisin, however it's pronounced, electric motors, and the carbon monocoque was a bit different than the outgoing LMP1 car as it didn't have an integrated roof. In that sense, almost echoing an open-wheeler, but, one that had decided to settle down, get a place out in the suburbs, and just needed something with a bit more capacity than it had previously. An SUV race car, if you will. The original concept was on display in January 2018 at the Tokyo Auto Salon, and the announcement of the homologation requirement later that year pushed the project into active development. Difficulties in developing vehicles to the new LMH, or Le Mans Hypercar regulations, complicated by continual changes in the regulations themselves, meant that the class debut was delayed till late in the 2020 or early in the 2021 season. This was then, of course, not helped by COVID, but the GR Supersport prototype made its debut at the delayed 2020 24 Hours of Le Mans as a camouflaged roadster, which is to say that it was a roadster wearing sort of that typical dazzle camouflage you see on prototype vehicles, not that it was a roadster driving around trying to appear as something else. It briefly ran a demo lap or two, and then delivered the race trophy to drum up anticipation for Toyota's racing-focused sibling that was coming the following year. Toyota also released more details at this point, including a target weight for the car of 1,030 kilos and a lower power output of 680 horsepower, which reflected the changes in the hypercar regulations that had occurred up to that point. The closed cockpit version had a rather interesting cockpit opening mechanism design, presumably because the small gullwing or butterfly doors that one sees on most LMP-style designs aren't suited for larger individuals to get in and out of, And more often than not, the people that have the money to buy these kind of things, and with a target price of $1 million that was being tossed around, the waistline not infrequently expands, as does one's corporate influence and thus one's wealth. Anyway, with all that delightful inflation that we've had inflicted upon us by, depending on your political views and capacity for understanding economics, either greedy corporations or insane government spending, it's entirely likely that by the time that the car had made it to the showroom floor, this would have increased substantially. However, by the time that all of this took place, the homologation requirement had been dropped from the rules, and prioritization thus shifted away from development of the road car, though Toyota was still working on the production version as late as July of 2021, when reports emerged that the program had been paused indefinitely after a fire during testing at Fuji Speedway. The car involved in the test was reportedly heavily damaged because, fire and carbon fiber don't mix all that well, and we haven't really heard anything about it since, so it has presumably been canceled outright, with organizational focus shifting to a raft of new concepts that debuted in 2023, including the GR-H2 racing concept, which is supposed to be hydrogen-powered. Not that anybody else has been promising that was coming in a year or two for the last 10 years. Still, it's better than electrics. Okay, let's pivot to another LMP1-based concept as number 2 on our list, one that, in contrast to the Toyota, was only revealed years after it was designed, studied, and squirreled away. The Audi Scorpion. By 2012, Audi was resting somewhat comfortably atop the endurance racing world's pecking order, having dominated Le Mans largely unopposed since the turn of the millennium, most recently with a series of diesel-engined prototypes of increasing sophistication capped by the recently developed R18 and R18 e-Tron Quattro, which successfully brought hybrid power to Le Mans for the first time, following a few false starts like the Oreca 01 that Hope Racing had trialed in 2011, the Panoz Espérance Q9 hybrid that actually never made it to Le Mans in 1998, and the very loose argument that can be made for the Howmet TX's electric reversing motor, which I really more just like to mention because it's such a darn cool automobile in its own right. Be that as it may, in late 2012 and early 2013, rumors swirled about Audi's upcoming hypercar. Road-going hypercar, reported to be based on the R18 much more directly than the R8 road car had been based on the R8 LMP of years prior. Building on that, the R18 road car's mechanicals, codenamed Project Scorpion for some bizarre reason, largely read as a repeat of the R18's. There would be a Dallara-built carbon fiber monocoque reinforced with an aluminum honeycomb, modified for both road legality and additional cabin space because, let's be honest, an LMP1 was hardly a capacious family truckster. Bodywork would have also been largely carbon fiber, although the use of aluminum in some panels probably wouldn't have been out of the question, and suspension would likely have been the standard double wishbones and pushrods we expect from hypercars and supercars and race cars these days. Sources inside Audi confirmed that the car was intended to use a retuned version of the R18's 3.7-liter turbocharged V6 diesel engine, sending power to the rear wheels, with an unspecified hybrid system providing occasional Quattro all-wheel drive to the fronts, though this likely would not have been a direct carryover from the LMP1's flywheel system, as those have a tendency not to adapt quite as well to road-going applications as some other hybrid options like lithium-ion batteries. Because for some weird reason, a flywheel spinning around at 50,000 RPM or 500,000 RPM or whatever they achieve, if, God forbid, there should be a crash, which, would lead to the flywheels being recharged, because usually that's some sort of emergency braking situation, you don't want a flywheel spinning at an ungodly number of revolutions per minute, sitting several inches beneath your feet or behind your head, or in front of your feet, for that matter. Unlike in the GR Supersport, however, there was discussion about increasing the diesel engine's power, which was limited by intake restrictors at the time in the R18 race car to around 515 horsepower. The discussion trended more towards north of 700 horses to position the car to compete with the contemporaneous Ferrari, the Porsche 918, and the McLaren P1. Engine power would likely have been deployed through a 7-speed double-clutch automatic driven from either an extract product similar to the 6-speed unit in the R18 Racer, or, more likely, some variant of one of the many VW Group double-clutch gearboxes, like the Porsche one that Hammond can so helpfully spell out for us in the original German.
It's a DOPPELKUPPLUNG SGETRIEBE. That's what it is.
Can we get it on the screen? Get it. Are there any Germans here?
That's a long word.
Or one of their other options. They were all, as far as my understanding goes, largely derivatives of each other. In fact, had the car actually made it to production, I don't think it would have been terribly surprising to have seen some shared mechanical componentry, namely in the gearbox and the hybrid system, between the Scorpion and the 918 to ease development costs and simplify some of the mechanicals. Not that Audi was really worried about spending money on their Le Mans program at that point, but, Performance, like its prospective competitors from other manufacturers, would probably have been targeting a top speed north of 210 miles an hour, which is 350 kph, I think, 0 to 62 miles an hour in below 3 seconds, a Nürburgring lap time of at or slightly below 7 minutes, etc., etc., etc. At the time that the design study was wrapped up in 2013, at least one mock-up had been created, which we're seeing here, which mixed styling from the R18 and Audi's current DTM machinery. And had it gone into production, deliveries would likely have commenced in 2017 or so. However, the design was shelved, and once Volkswagen Gruppe was hit with the naughty stick by the American EPA for their diesel skullduggery in 2015, well, they didn't have huge amounts of money left over. Diesel rather fell out of favor as the fuel of the future that it had seemed on the cusp of becoming up until that point. And given all of those things, and the fact that Audi withdrew from Le Mans in 2016, well, the car certainly wasn't, at that point, coming to a road near you. The car then existed largely in only rumor and speculation until just about a year ago, when the mock-up we've been looking at showed up rather unexpectedly at the August Hoch Museum in Zwickau. Apologies for any mispronunciations there. Personally, I don't think it has enough of the R18's looks to make it all that aesthetically compelling, but I do like the front fascia. It's also worth noting that Audi did create another concept to celebrate their diesel success a couple of years earlier with the R8 V12 TDI Le Mans concept, but they declined to put that into production as well, citing the high costs of redeveloping the chassis to fit the planned 6-liter turbodiesel V12. However, since it was technically a revised version of an existing road car model, the Scorpion got the video spot. Still, the R8 version was much more likely to go into production, all things considered, even though it didn't. Okay, let's keep it in the diesel family for just a bit longer, but let's get comfy with it, and see what the French decided to do with their Le Mans-winning diesel power plant. Yes, it's time for the gentle touch with the Peugeot 908 RC. Actually developed before the 908 had ever turned a wheel in anger, Peugeot took some of the design concepts that they had promulgated in the 908 Racer concept and the mechanicals that they had been refining for the upcoming 908 HDI FAP and packaged them all up in a new range-topping concept sedan to stand companion to their return to La Sarthe. This car was set to debut at the 2006 Paris Motor Show and follow on where the earlier RC concepts had left off. Presumably, in this instance, RC stands for really comfortable, rather than its usual use at Peugeot for their sport models and concepts, because in contrast to the Audi concepts we just covered, which clearly hewed quite closely to their sporting origins, Peugeot decided to make a large luxury sedan. I will do a video just cynically reading the press release at a later date because I find all of them quite amusing, and even though the Volvo Your Concept Car video didn't particularly do all that well, it was quite entertaining for me to do. Be that as it may, this big cushy sedan nevertheless had a competition-derived engine mounted in a competition-derived place. The same 5.5-liter twin-turbo diesel V12 with high-pressure direct injection and particulate filtering, still mounted rear amidships, but at least to me slightly weirdly transversely oriented, just behind the passenger compartment, which contributes to the somewhat unusual rear dimensions and silhouette. The power plant was capable of 700 horsepower and a monstrous 1,200 newton meters or 885 pound-feet of torque, sending power to the rear wheels through a 6-speed sequential gearbox. Those figures would have been quite appropriate for an LMP1 of the time, and indeed they were, because that's kind of what the 908 made, and it would have made the 908 RC the world's most powerful 4-door production sedan, outdoing the Mercedes-Benz S65 AMG that, for its contemporaneous W220 iteration, made 604 horsepower and 1,001 newton meters of torque from its 6-liter twin-turbo petrol-powered V12, a title that an S-Class held until 2014, when Dodge made the Hellcat with 707 horsepower, but nowhere near as many torques. Actually, having owned a non-AMG fettled, but still twin-turbo V12-equipped W220 S-Class, I can say it's a fantastic driving experience, and as absolutely unnecessary as a V12 is for normal highway cruising, a diesel V12 would have been even more delightfully unnecessary and spectacularly worthwhile nonetheless. Actually, imagine if they'd gone on to make a CL-class competitor with the same power plant, which, that would have been fabulous. Peugeot also kindly provides us with some estimated performance figures, although whether these were, back of the napkin math or something they actually put some time into is a little harder to determine. But they forecasted capabilities for the 908RC in excess of 300 kilometers an hour, or 186 miles an hour for those of us in non-metric lands, and something that is a 1,000 meter DA that could be completed in 22 seconds, whatever that is. Presumably, it's a 1 kilometer drag race. I'm going to assume that 22 seconds is good for that, presumably, because otherwise they wouldn't have put it in the press release. But, of course, I live in non-metric lands, and we do quarter-mile drag races over here, and 22 seconds for a quarter-mile drag race would be abysmal. I think my MGB could probably manage a quarter mile in 22 seconds, and it's got 90 horsepower. You'd probably expect that kind of performance from, I don't know, a first-generation diesel VW Cabrio thing, rather than a 700 horsepower limousine. So, yeah, for the purposes of this exercise, we'll assume, yes, a 1 kilometer drag race. Fair play to you all. 22 seconds is lovely. The car was built around a carbon composite and aluminum honeycomb unibody and a subassembly for the engine and rear drivetrain components, while bodywork was of an unspecified construction material, but presumably would have been primarily either aluminum or carbon fiber if it had ever gone into production. Given the general need for solidity over out-and-out weight savings in large luxury sedans, I'd be inclined to guess that it wouldn't have been entirely carbon, some components perhaps, but more aluminum and maybe even some steel. The styling was, as we've noted, a bit unusual, particularly the kinked A-pillars in the front and this faired-in rear window, which was still, I think, aesthetically necessary, as the fairing artificially extends the roofline around part of the engine cover so that the car doesn't look like a 1960s Ford Anglia that moved to France and got delusions of grandeur. For most of the angles in the promotional photos, I actually rather like the general aesthetic of the car, but the one they picked for the press packet header does look a bit like somebody accidentally melted a second layer of bodywork over another smaller car, like some sort of strange automotive toasted cheese where the cheese melted down over the sides of the bread because the bread was too small. Okay, this is getting a bit niche on the references and a bit rambly overall. Moving on. Suspension was drop-linked double wishbones, and braking came from enormous Brembo carbon ceramic disc brakes, 38 centimeters in diameter in the front and 35 in the rear, which is 15 and 14 inches or thereabouts in imperial, I think. Front calipers were 6-piston units and rears were 4 pots, again about what one would expect for a race-derived executive sedan. I think when I pulled apart my S600 at the end of its life, the rotors were steel, but that's an S600, not an S65, so they were also naturally a bit smaller and only had 4-piston calipers, but there were still enormous units to ensure maximum stoppage in minimal distance. I will leave the discussion and review of the interior and other concept car gubbins till a separate video, as they are clearly not derived from the 908 Racer, although now that I'm recording this in retrospect from the rest of the script, I don't hew to that in others. But I will say it looked, at least in my opinion, quite pleasantly modern and comfortable in there. Generally a strong point for large French sedans, although I could see those thigh-adjacent controls becoming problematically located for operation while driving. Needless to say, I doubt this car was ever really considered for production, and again, more's the pity because I do love a big super sedan, and if these had been in production by 2008, 2009 or so, they wouldn't be that far off from being US importable. And big sedans like this always drop value faster than a biotech startup who's had their government research grants canceled. Usually topical reference there. Anyway, that's about it for the 908. Let's head back to Germany and back to the 90s to what Car Styling magazine called the most thoroughly developed and best engineered and executed show car from a European manufacturer, the Mercedes-Benz C112. In the 90s, our friends in Stuttgart had been moving back into endurance racing for the first time in a goodly while. Partnering with chassis constructor Sauber on the somewhat middling C8 and the rather excellent C9, before finally putting their name on the car with the C11, which replaced the C9 after its dominant 1989 season. Simultaneously, Mercedes road cars were arguably at the apex of their reputation for quality and over-engineering, and they decided to explore one of their few non-occupied aspirational markets, the fairly new market segment of luxury supercar. Not dissimilar to how Porsche had approached the Coupe B /959/961 project, Mercedes decided to tie the new car in with their motorsport projects. But unlike the Coupe B or their future efforts in GT1, there were no homologation requirements for Group C, and thus the tie-ins could be more surface and brand level than mechanically exacting. So, Mercedes proceeded with designing more of a companion model for the road rather than rebuilding their race car for the road, but you know what? That was probably for the best. Why? Well, the C11, like all the Group C cars, was optimized for fuel efficiency, which didn't exactly leave a lot of room for creature comforts or, cabin space for a proper passenger. To be fair, if they'd been only optimized for top speed like the GTPs in IMSA at the time, it still wouldn't have been any better. The C11 was powered by a highly tuned version of Mercedes' M119 V8, displacing 5 liters and with a couple of KKK turbos that, when running at high boost pressures, could get 850 horsepower from the engine at 7,000 RPM and bring a fantastic soundtrack to go with it. The new chassis and suspension for the C11 versus the C9 was substantially stiffer, and it generated oodles of downforce. Again, not great for adaptation into a road car. So instead, they took the general concepts of designing a Group C prototype and built a road car using those principles, while also integrating some of the experimental testbed mindset that they had embraced with the C111. This time focusing on dynamic ride control systems and aerodynamics rather than primarily on the power plants. The racing twin-turbo V8 was replaced with an even larger but much more civilized M120 naturally aspirated V12, Mercedes' first road-going production V12 that would later go on to power the CLK GTR and Pagani's Zonda in somewhat larrier forms. This engine produced a comparatively paltry 408 horsepower, but 427 pound-feet of torque that went to the rear wheels through a 6-speed manual gearbox. These mechanicals were mounted, instead of in a carbon tub as in the C11, in an ultralight, 130 pounds or about 59 kgs, bonded aluminum monocoque that also featured an integrated steel roll cage for safety. Bodywork was aluminum and Kevlar instead of carbon and Kevlar, but there was still complicated rear aero, including a big rear, technically a diffuser. Unlike more modern race car diffusers, these just look like pretty large Venturi tunnels, rather than anything with a lot of strakes and finials and so on. Stopping power came from Brembo ventilated disc brakes and 4-pot calipers on all 4 wheels, but that was about the last of the elements that could be more or less tied to Group C racing technology, because, Mercedes had the bit between their teeth at this point, and they just kept going on the what things can we add to it motif, integrating an active spoiler under the front bumper to improve downforce, which could reportedly hit about 2,200 pounds or 1 metric ton, so still quite considerable at the car's top speed of 192 miles an hour. With 0 to 62 miles an hour, or 0 to 100 kph, estimated at 4.9 seconds, although that supposes that one can trust Mercedes' official estimates, which in my experience have typically been a bit modest. In a nod to their first great road-going racer turned supercar, the 300 SL, gull-wing doors were the order of the day, the rear wing lifted to augment stopping power and hark back to the 300 SLR, and they made sure to trim the interior with a bunch of parts lifted from the range-topping S-classes. Although since this was the early 90s, that does unfortunately still mean some slightly plasticky leather and other bits. What else did we have? They also built in active rear-wheel steering, controlled electronically rather than using a passive setup like the VSOC axle that Porsche were using on the 928. And the car also debuted ABC, active body control, which was Mercedes and I think the world's first active suspension system for in this case a prototype, but later to debut on their production cars. The car was constructed and ready to debut at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1991, where Mercedes touted it as a production-ready sports car that blended Group C technology with safety and road-friendly driving dynamics, which is a better mix than they would be able to later claim with the CLK GTR Strassenversion. And to the great joy of the better-heeled motor show attendees, Mercedes was even taking deposits against a production run of the car. They reportedly received more than 700 commitments, including some essentially blank checks, but the man who had overseen the car's construction, Werner Niefer, was no longer with the company after some questionable/unfortunate activities, and the new Mercedes leadership decided that they didn't need a supercar, and thus canned the project before the second vehicle, a development model to refine the design for production, could be completed. The world would have to wait until the end of the decade before they could get their hands on a Mercedes V12-powered race car for the road, and arguably until 1999 for something that was actually usable, which finally came in the form of the Zonda. There are some reports that indicate that Mercedes wasn't actually taking deposits, and it was just that they fielded a lot of offers, but reports vary, and we're, again, just going with what I saw more frequently reported. For our final car, we're keeping it with Mercedes and heading back to what can only be called their Annus Horribilis, 1955. 1955 saw the debut, domination, and withdrawal of Mercedes' new sports racer, the 300 SLR. Derived from the W196 Formula One racer that had won the 1954 and would go on to win the 1955 World Championship, the SLR was intended to do the same for the World Sports Car Championship. The F1-focused 2.5-liter straight-8 engine was enlarged to 3 liters for endurance racing and was capable of sending 310 horsepower to the rear wheels through a 5-speed manual transaxle. The steel tube spaceframe chassis was modified to accommodate a driver and navigator for the long road races like the Mille Miglia and Carrera Panamericana. The magnesium alloy bodywork was extended to fair in the wheels and additional chassis width, and the enormous drum brakes were carried over directly from the W196. The suspension for the new car was fairly conventional, with double wishbones at the front supported by torsion bars, while the rear swing axles were optimized to prevent the car from hiking a wheel during heavy cornering. 9 chassis were constructed, 7 roadsters for the 1955 World Sports Car Championship season, and 2 set aside at Rudolf Uhlenhaut's direction to be converted into coupes, intended to race in that year's Carrera Panamericana, and to serve as test beds for the 1956 version of the race car, and as a future successor to the 300 SL road car. In addition to some further chassis widening over the Roadster, the coupe's bodywork largely resembled the 300 SL, but just a bit more mad. Something akin to a 300 SL Black Series, almost, if AMG had been doing the naming in those days. Gull-wing doors were still the means of entry and egress, but of course they were a necessity rather than an aesthetic nod in those days, as the tube space frame had remarkably high sills to ensure chassis rigidity, and normal doors would have opened onto the tube frame and, looked rather shoddy. Modifications to bring the car to market were never fully detailed, but most likely would not have had to be extensive. We'll get to that a bit more in a moment. The coupe weighed in at a relatively lightweight 1,117 kilos, or 2,463 pounds, although this was substantially weightier than the 901 kilos of the SLR Roadster, and top speed dropped commensurately. Mercedes quotes the top speed of the Roadster as greater than 300 kph, or 186 miles an hour, while the coupe could only achieve around 290. Had it made it to production, this would nevertheless have established it as the fastest road car in the world, taking the crown from its older sibling and, ceteris paribus, a crown it would have held incontrovertibly for almost 15 years, until the Lamborghini Miura hit 288.6 kph, or possibly until the Countach hit 293 in 1982. That's not to say that that's exactly what would have happened, because nothing exists in a vacuum, but we'll leave that as a historical hypothetical. Of course, as we all know, this is actually all historical hypothetical, because none of this came to pass. The 1955 Le Mans 24 Hours remains as probably the darkest day in all of sports car racing, and I would argue in all of motorsport, and Mercedes hurriedly withdrew from all racing activities for 3 decades. Putting a road-going version of the car that had not inadvertently, but that had caused so much death and destruction would have, well, God, been ethically questionable at best, and thus Mercedes declined to develop the car any further. Uhlenhaut, who apparently never actually owned a car, which I find bizarre, took one of the 2 coupes that had been built as his company car and did go on to modify it for road use, which apparently consisted merely of adding mufflers to quiet the enormous side-mounted exhaust, and he used it for commuting for many years. One of the cars, probably thus not Uhlenhaut's, and the second coupe then, was occasionally lent out for motoring tests to journalists, all of whom universally praised the car's performance and road manners, and equally universally bemoaned that it had never been put into serial production, quite understandably. The car that remains on display at the Mercedes Museum was Uhlenhaut's own, while the second car sold for a staggering $142 million in 2022 to a private buyer, almost doubling the previous record for the highest price paid for an automobile. Fortunately, it's the only car in this video so far that has its own Assetto Corsa model, at least that I've been able to find, and it is an absolute joy to drive virtually, which is all that I, or realistically any of us, will ever have the privilege of doing, unfortunately. Still, stunning looking thing, and anytime I talk about the 1955 Le Mans disaster, I just get very sad. So, for our honorable mention, we are going to stretch the premise slightly, as always, to include the McLaren M6GT, which, instead of being an attempt by Mr. McLaren at making a Le Mans racer for the road, was an attempt to make a Can-Am car for Le Mans, and then eventually for the road. Building on his experiences at the French race with Ford and his own work in dominating the second Can-Am season, which means, of course, that our story starts in late 1967, with the recently victorious M6A chosen for conversion to Le Mans spec. 1968, however, was a year that brought back some fun and interesting problems for those with relatively budget-friendly Le Mans ambitions. Ford's domination of the race in 1966 and 67, in which Mr. McLaren had, of course, played a not insignificant part, led to the rewriting of the rules that re-established a displacement cap for Group 6 of just 3 liters. I'm not sure if it was called Group 6 when they did that to Jag back in the late 50s, but you know what I mean. As Can-Am had no such restrictions, and thus McLaren's sports car experience was predominantly with V8s in the much larger than 3 liters range, Group 4 was really the only way to go. But that, too, was still problematic. You had to build 50 of the darn things to be eligible, and so far really only Lola and Ford were close to that number with the T70 and the GT40 and its many derivatives respectively, and you were still limited to 5 liters. The primary advantage that McLaren had in counter to this was that the M6A was fundamentally a pretty straightforward automobile, even if it was advanced for the time in its individual elements. Those elements were McLaren's first monocoque, constructed from aluminium with fiberglass bodywork. Suspension was double wishbones on all 4 corners with coil springs over dampers at the front and twin trailing arms at the rear. You had rack and pinion steering, which actually I'm trying to think if there's any cars that I've made a video about that were post-war that didn't have rack and pinion steering, and I don't think there are. There were Gearling ventilated disc brakes, a ZF 5-speed gearbox, and a 5.7-liter variable Chevy LT1 V8 motor. McLaren partnered with a Surrey-based constructor, Trojan, who had previously been building the Elva Courier after they acquired that business in 1962, and they were initially given responsibility for building customer versions of the M6A, the M6B, which were offered for sale without a power plant for the 1968 Can-Am season, but would also be further produced for the team's Le Mans efforts. Meanwhile, McLaren themselves turned to creating a coupe body for racing in the World Sports Car Championship and at Le Mans. The design they penned largely resembled the base M6, but obviously wearing a hat, and with a slightly softer front and rear design to compensate for the greater drag brought on by addition of a windscreen and roof. This also made allowance for the fact that many of the World Sports Car Championship tracks were generally higher speed, lower downforce configurations than the twisty Can-Am tracks for which the M6A had been originally designed and optimized. However, the underlying mechanicals remained fundamentally unchanged, as the original plan was to just sell the 50 cars required to others who could then go presumably race them domestically or abroad. I also think that aesthetically it has notes of sort of Marcos Mantis in the front and Chevron B16 in the rear, but maybe that's just me. Thoughts on other resemblances in the comments below. Specialized moldings, who've been mentioned on the channel several times, were brought in to actually produce the bodywork shells, and mass production was authorized sometime in mid-1968, with some reports indicating that all of the panels needed to build the 50 cars required for homologation were built in one go. The first race-ready version of the new car was ready in January of 1969, and a Le Mans campaign was in the works when the homologation limits dropped to 25 cars, coincided with the arrival of the Porsche 917, and caused McLaren to rethink his plans for his car, because, being the clever chap that he was, he realized that a converted Can-Am car was not really going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the 917, and, well, frankly, he was probably right. Nevertheless, 2 additional cars were built, with the first model sold to a David Proffitt, who took its racing in 1970 without great success, surprise, surprise, after which it was sold to a Canadian chap that actually converted it for use as a road car. The second chassis was retained for use as a show car, while the third became Mr. McLaren's personal vehicle, with him planning to use it as a living, working testbed for refinements that would make their way into the first generation of McLaren road cars, based on the M6. McLaren's untimely death in early 1970 brought an end to the project, and the third chassis was bought by Denny Hulme. I think I said it right this time. Mean internet people. And shipped to New Zealand, although it has more recently been sold and now lives in the United States. Several additional coupes were constructed as replicas, using the leftover bodies and some M6B chassis, but it would take another 20 years before McLaren would produce their first true road car, the inimitable F1, which also fulfilled Mr. McLaren's long-held dream of an outright win for a car bearing his name at Le Mans in 1995. Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another 3/4 of an hour watching or listening to Lensler. I do hope it's been an enjoyable spend of your time. For this week's shameless plugs for relevant content on the channel, we have previously discussed the Toyota GR010 hypercar, and the hypercar class in general, although I do inadvertently call it the TS050 and I think some of the title cards and maybe the voiceover, mea culpa. I've talked about the Panaud's Espérance GTR1 and the hybrid version thereof in its own video. Ditto the Howmet TX, the Peugeot 908 HDI. Mercedes' Group C efforts are mentioned in the Group C story video. The CLK GTR is mentioned in DEFCON GT. The Porsche Gruppe B is mentioned in the second 5 cars that video. There are several videos that touch on the Lola T70, and I think that about covers it. For this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
Like, comment, subscribe.
remember to water your pants as well as your plants. Okay, that one was really a bit more absurd than it needed to be, wasn't it? Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.